Okay, over to you, Fazna.
Thank you so much, Simon. Hi, this is Fazana. I just want to introduce our presenter. I just want to mention that we were supposed to have two presenters today, but unfortunately one of them canceled it 2 days ago because of emergency situation. And now I'm going to introduce Bronwyn Horne. She is the academic head at the Animation School South Africa and is currently completing her PhD in the Wits School of Art in Johannesburg. She holds an MA in digital arts. Her PhD research interest focuses on developing a hybrid animation technique using digital 3D animation, laser cutting, and the strata stencil animation technique. Her PhD short film, Chronomation, has been screened at 19 festivals worldwide. Thank you so much, Bronwyn, to be here today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Fazna. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to move this guy over there. Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
Loud and
yes.
clear.
Excellent. Okay, hi everyone. As Fazna has introduced me, my name is Bronwyn Horne, and I'm here today to present my research by creative practice, which I'm completing at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you to Fazna and Dr. Simon Payne for this opportunity to present my research on an international forum. Just a bit more relevant information about myself. You have mentioned my degree, so I do have a degree in fine art. I just wanted to mention that I was specializing in archival hand paper making. So I used to run the University of Johannesburg's archival paper mill, which serviced various local conservation institutions like the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the National Archives of South Africa. And then my other degree was in digital animation, a little bit diverse, but this is where I really began to focus on and expand on my personal interest in character animation. I also have a very strong interest in education, so I started teaching paper making in the rural communities in 1998, and then moved into more formal education where I ran the postgraduate animation degrees at Wits University from 2013. So I'm now the academic head at a private institution called the Animation School. We have a 3-year diploma in animation where students focus mostly on the technical skills and artistry required in short form production. Although I no longer make paper, I still have a strong passion for the materiality of the medium and wanted to bring together my interest in paper and animation, which led me to the study. So the title of my thesis is called Animated Sequences, Chronophotography in Contemporary Animation Practice. I am currently in the completion stage of writing up my thesis for examination. I was very, very, very fortunate to have completed the creative practice and exhibited the work in February 2020. So it was just before the COVID pandemic hit our country. So my exhibition ran for 3 out of the scheduled 6 weeks. So at least I got some public time there. So tonight I will be showcasing the underlying theories that informed my research and show you a little bit about the production and the creative process. So I hope you all enjoy. And why isn't it changing slides? There you go. Okay, so character animation has rapidly become a popular form of entertainment. It's a diverse medium with a long history that has resulted in varying approaches, techniques, and styles. Classic cartoon-style animation is renowned for its absurdity, excessive style, and abstract approaches to representation. My interest lies in the movement in these cartoons, the imperceptible moments that are lost in standard viewing practice. Using techniques of chronophotography, my creative practice reveals the construction of animation for the viewer. It's about sequences, a series of images that question our understanding of a movement and the aesthetics involved in seeing more than one frame at a time. In doing this, I challenge the viewer to look at cartoons in a different way. What does viewing a sequence of images do to our experience and understanding of that image? An image that normally only remains on our retina for 1/24th of a second. My aim is to slow animation down, even freeze it in some instances, with the aim of transforming it from a process of illusion to a method of investigation. It's about making the imperceptible perceptible and raises questions about how images speak to us. Chronophotography was a photographic technique that was developed in the 19th century to help scientists study objects, humans, and animals in motion. They were able to capture fleeting moments, resulting in various kinds of sequential images or images of simultaneity, photographs that challenged our notion of how we read an image. From these photographs of movements, measurements could be taken and motion could be studied. It is a visual medium that forces the viewer to shift their modes of viewing to examine the mechanics of a movement. I am particularly interested in the work of Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Marie. In my thesis, I focus on their opposing approaches to their interest in movement analysis and present an argument for how their distinct representational formats influence viewer engagement and consequent readings of a work. Early photography was celebrated for its ability to arrest motion and depict a reality that we were unable to see truthfully with the naked eye. Edward Muybridge played a pivotal role in the evolution of the photographic instant. His 1878 images of a horse not only resolved the mystery of unsupported transit in the horse's gait, but offered the conditions for what cinema was to become. Arguably, his greatest innovation was how he approached Governor Stanford's request for a single image of his horse with all four legs off of the ground. He understood that in order to analyze motion, he needed to photograph a sequence of images fractions of a second apart, and his choice to present the sequence of these images to an audience assembled in a manner that suggests motion was even more critical. In my thesis, I explore modes of viewing practice through Muybridge's Animal Locomotion series of 1887. I argue that by using creative choices in the presentation of his images, it affects viewer interaction and subsequent readings of the work. Muybridge has continually been criticized for scientific authenticity. I recognize how he used his foundational artistic knowledge and pictorial traditions to condition the way he used the camera, seeking innovative methods for representing his photographic subjects in his motion studies. Contrastingly, Etienne Jules Marie was a medical physician, an inventor, and a scientist. His systematic approach led him to seek visual representations of a continuous recorded event, first through chronography, which were his graphic notations, and then through photography, inspired by Muybridge's images, which he then termed chronophotography. For Marie, photographs allowed the viewer to assess movements of the body visually, revealing the various positions of the body whilst enacting a motion. This was something that his chronographs couldn't do. But Marie was dissatisfied with the staccato effect of Muybridge's isolated phases of a movement. He was seeking a visible expression for continuity and the rhythm of a movement in a single image. By developing a photographic gun, he was able to capture a fluid visual expression of time and motion in his multi-exposed chronophotographs. He also developed a system of transforming his subject into a graphic representation, which you see on the bottom right of the screen, by focusing only on the joints and limbs, the parts responsible for movement. This method of simplification provided a clearer representation of the mechanics of movement. Calling them geometric chronophotographs, Marie went beyond scientific evaluation and provided the visual language for abstraction in art. As an animator, well over a century later, this visual language is captivating and enlightening as it illustrates the positions of a joint and a limb on each frame of a walk cycle, the flow, poses, and the timing of a movement. Although created for the purpose of scientific analysis, chronophotography inspired many modern artists interested in exploring visual approaches to representing movement. For instance, Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase is a static image of movement as an abstraction, an interpretation expressed in a painting. Similarly, Norman McLaren applied the concept to his film Pas de Dieu to fulfill his fascination for representing movement for movement's sake, something he called abstract ballet. He explores the notion of movement moving, asking the question, how do we activate this feeling and keep it active in our perception? Other artists such as Kupka, Balla, and Bragaglia, to name a few, all use aspects of chronophotography in their practice. Similarly, my interest is in chronophotography as a representational practice and the aesthetic opportunities it affords artists. Over the last decade, contemporary artists are again finding a new artistic interest in chronophotography by approaching modern materials and technologies to suit their own purposes and research. They are in some way continuing one or more of the inquiries of the 19th century chronophotographers through their own practice. There are many aspects that draw artists to chronophotography. In my research, it was the investigative nature that inspired an experimental approach and the development of a hybrid animation technique to circumvent the restricting conventions tied to the standardized process. It was also the visual aesthetic of specifically of Marie's multi-exposed images, something I wanted to emulate in moving image practice. I saw this as an opportunity to escape the traditional modes of cinematic representation, of viewing one frame at a time. In doing this, it raises questions about the mechanics of perception. So in other words, the camera's truth versus lived experience. I also felt that through applying the technique, there was a potential to educate the viewer on how animation is made by exposing the components that make up an animated movement. So, is there a relationship between chronophotography and animation? Other than being an indispensable resource that provides accurate images of how the body moves in an action, as well as information on the timing and duration of an action, it's not really used in any other way by contemporary animators. However, the sequential and superimposed nature of the images are commonplace in our practice. Analyzing movement in a frame-by-frame manner is what we do, but we are dealing with a lot more than what the audience sees in the final product. To put it simply, instead of seeing one man picking up a pencil, we need to keep a version of this man in our mind on every frame of the animation, or at the very minimum, the keys and breakdowns, much in the same way that Mari's images do. The audience does not see it like this, but we use software techniques called ghosting or onion skinning, similar to what you are seeing here, as a construction tool when designing a movement. But the process of revealing motion is not generally used to inform the aesthetic or conceptual nature of an animated work. My aim was to find a way of revealing this for the viewer in a way that was both aesthetically appealing and challenged their reading of the work. But how could I do this? So I first approached the question of what differentiates animation from live action film. They're both cinematic projections of moving, talking characters in some type of narrative framework. I argue that one of the key factors lies in movement itself. How do animated characters move? What makes them different? This led me to investigate how animation emerged as a practice. I do this by looking at one of the key role players, Walt Disney, and how he innovated techniques and practices to develop it into a viable commercial business model. I compared Disney's approach of realism or verisimilitude in animation with the abstract approach of the Warner Studio. I argue that while the Disney style was prolific, innovative, and to some degree established the medium, it created an emphasis on realism and other elements rooted in classic Hollywood cinema. Warner deviated from this approach, creating a fresh new style to animation, one that was dynamic, experimental, and skillfully elusive. The less constrained Warner Studio gave rise to some pivotal figures in animation, allowing them the freedom to explore their craft. Tex Avery and Chuck Jones are arguably some of the finest directors in animation history. With Avery's philosophy of anything can happen in a cartoon, and Jones's focus on character personality and innovative approaches to movement representation, they reacted to Disney's innovations, resulting in some of the most influential work in the animated medium. Smears, multiples, squashes, and stretches, these abstract and humorous approaches to movement representation are fundamental to what made these cartoons so memorable and differentiated them from live-action film. But their construction goes unnoticed because they are presented to us at 24 frames per second. Some of these techniques are only on screen for 1 or 2 frames, making them imperceptible to the viewer. So how can this be exploited? What aspects of chronophotography can offer opportunities to explore these nuances of animation that are imperceptible to an audience? Chronophotography and animation bear an inverse relationship. One is a static image that isolates the phases of a realistic movement. The other uses chronological progression of images to mimic movement and caricature it. However, when viewing the individual frames of an animation side by side with a chronophotograph, the results are similar in approach and format. In my study, I propose an integrated method for examining and viewing animated motion. For this, I blend between chronophotographic and animation practices, static and moving, and through doing so, highlight opportunities for creative exploration. I argue that static sequential images impose a complex interaction process on the viewer. Because of their fixed nature, the viewer has time to process the images using their own experience and understanding. But in the cinematic format, it commands an interaction based on the method of presentation, which is at 24 frames per second and out of the viewer's control. This changes the nature of this engagement. It's the difference between a voluntary process versus the imposition of an illusionary experience. This research aims to bridge the gap between the still and the moving image, in order to create an innovative viewing experience, one that imposes movement but forces the viewer to question the nature of its construction. It explores how chronophotographic techniques could be used to slow animated time for an unconventional aesthetic and a different viewing experience. I do this by applying the multi-exposed visual aesthetic of Maury's chronophotographs. By using an established yet underexplored animation technique called strata stencil, I demonstrate my interest in exposing the construction of animated movement in an experimental short film. Developed by animator and artist Jovan Ivy in 2007 as part of a stop-motion class requirement at the Pratt Institute, the strata stencil technique involves many layers of paper stencils, stacked and photographed one at a time to create a paper tunnel-like effect. It's an experimental technique that has been used in a few different ways. In Ivy's traditional sense, using paper cutouts, which you see here, some artists have explored its potential digitally using programs like After Effects, and others that have tried more sculptural forms using perspex or wood. Ivy was inspired by the mind-bending strata cut animation technique made popular by filmmakers like David Daniels in the 1980s. Strata cut, which you are seeing on the left, is a form of stop motion where the animation is embedded in a mound of clay, where movement is achieved by slicing the thin sheets from the loaf. Because of the way the animation is created, which is sculpturally, the animator needs to have an instinctive sense of movement that is very different from standard animation practice. Strata stencil, which you are seeing on the right, uses paper cutouts for each frame of the animation, where the movement is constructed according to traditional animation practices. Each individual cutout or stencil is then filmed in succession using stop-motion techniques on a customized filming rig. This technique allows each frame to remain visible for approximately 1 second of film. Pausing the sequence at any point in the animation will display a range of motions similar to Marie's images or the ghosting technique used in animation software, rather than the single slice of life represented in standard animation practice. It is the ideal technique for analyzing the present and the past, a new approach for experiencing motion and methods of perception, and this is what drew me to the technique. For my film, I chose to use paper as a base for the animation. Strata stencil can be made from many other materials, like I've mentioned, wood or perspex, but paper was the most pliable, forgiving, and cost-effective. As a digital animator, this may seem like a strange choice, but my early career as an archival hand paper maker inspired the use of paper. Although I no longer make paper, the materiality of the medium will always resonate with me and incite my passion for art making. And believe it or not, there was a very small moment in this project where I considered making the paper for the film, until I did the math of how long it would take and the technicalities this imposed on the rest of the process. I also spent many years running a laser cutting company, so immediately the idea of combining paper, laser cutting, and animation intrigued me, but it didn't seem possible. And then in 2013, John Lewis released a Christmas advert called The Bear and the Hare. For the production of the film, they used traditional 2D animators to create the animation, which was then printed and laser cut frame by frame. Each laser cut character was then placed into a hand-built set and filmed using stop motion. The process was captivating. Using concept and the aesthetics of chronophotography with a focus on cartoony animation, I was ready to embark on my personal project. And yes, that does mean I have been registered since 2014. It's been a while. Okay, so the creative work resulted in 2 key outputs. Together, entitled The Chronomation, it comprises of an experimental animated short film and exhibition that opened at the Wits Art Museum on the 18th of February in 2020. The film has gained much attention in the international film market, being screened at 19 international festivals and won Best Animation at the 3-Minute Film Festival in Santa Barbara. The film examines animated movements of characters from the golden age of American animation. Using shots from prolific animation directors of the era, I conducted frame-by-frame analysis into the motion of their characters, much like that of Muybridge on his gymnasts. It was completed using a hybrid animation process that I developed to suit my interests and skill sets in digital 3D animation, laser cutting, and paper. Each frame was animated using Autodesk Maya. The characters were designed to share generic bodies to capitalizing on the rigging process and remove the focus of the characters themselves. It was not meant to replicate the original. Because the film was never supposed to be completed digitally, and I mean lit and rendered, the characters were never textured. Instead, I rendered out black and white silhouettes to provide the information required for the laser cutter. I added a light fill pass to provide the engraving information. The vectorizing process needed to be automated. There were just too many frames to craft by hand, and the laser cutter is very unforgiving on mistakes. The machine requires precise, clean vectors with certain RGB values, fills, and widths assigned to each. The constant back and forth process confirmed the experimental nature of the work, as it veered further away from the standard animation production pipeline. The film was only 2.5 minutes in length. I was working at 12 frames per second, but this equated to 1,900 frames to be processed. This meant each frame had to undergo 3D animation, rendering, vectorizing, and then laser cutting. Any mistake or broken stencil meant repeating the process again. The laser cutting process alone took up 15 minutes per frame. Cleaning and storage was also a big concern, as the frames had to remain in perfect condition for the filming, which only happened twice during the project. What became apparent that was like the main research concern about time, the production process was becoming a micro-measurement of time itself. When added, processing times accumulated from days to weeks and then months. Every phase in the production needed to be carefully planned and calculated to ensure completion. I just wanted to speak to the laser cutting part. So here we can see the laser cutting in action. The darker parts that you see, that is the engravings, which takes the longest to process. The cut lines are quite quick, but often create the most headaches. It is also quite a dangerous process. There's imminent risk of fire, so you cannot step away from the machine at all while it's cutting. So in addition to being labor intensive, you also have to waste a lot of time just staring at the lines cutting. Okay, so on the top right, you can see the laser cutter. It's a small little desktop laser cutter, which I actually also have next to me here. And on the left, you'll see the stacks of paper that I used to create the frames. I also had to keep very detailed records of the process frames for tracking and planning of the production. I was on quite a tight deadline because I booked my exhibition a year in advance. So I had to make sure that I was going to meet it. And luckily, it was systematic enough to be able to track every part of the process. These are some of the stacked frames, completed frames ready for filming. Each frame had to be cleaned and stored properly. So when you laser cut paper, it creates this like soot, almost like a black residue that comes from the paper, the burning process. So you have to clean every frame before you store it, else they'll all just come out with fingerprints and black marks, which is not ideal. And then this image shows the simplicity of the filming rig. It was really just constructed of 2 suspended poles with curtain hooks to hold the paper. We ended up marking the poles to maintain a distance between the frames, mostly for our sanity because it got very difficult. It was a very finicky process. We even had to label the walls with left and right because our brains during the process just literally melted. And we only had 2 shoots. They were about 2 weeks each, but it was just about, taking the photo, moving everything back, putting the new frame on. It was very, very tedious. Okay, so through identifying abstract methods of representing motion that gave meaning to movement, the strata stencil technique was used to expose the animation's construction in order to offer a novel viewing experience. I used methods of simplification to further create an emphasis on movement in a montage of action sequences that resist the sequential logic of narrative-driven animation. This clip is just a snippet of the film. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end to be able to watch the entire film. The exhibition fulfilled 3 purposes. So the screening of the experimental short film, the exhibition of the laser cut frames, and a sideline exhibition that completed an educational role for both historical chronophotography and animation mechanics. The exhibition included frameworks, installations, and printed media. The aim was to showcase the material items that resulted from the creative practice in a manner that further questioned their validity in a chronophotographic study in contemporary animation practice. In the static works, levels of repetition forced the viewer to see things that they never saw in the film. In this printed version of the film, which was about 2.5 meters by 1.5 meters in size, it reveals the structure of animation itself, breaking it down frame by frame from a process of illusion to a method of investigation. By arresting movement in each shot, I shift the focus on how they were made, 1 frame at a time, and through this mode of very close analysis, it provides an account of the aesthetics of movement itself. This raises questions about what we are seeing. Does knowing more about a particular technical process shape what we are able to see, or even how we see it? Can we treat these works as sites of potential knowledge? And what if we treated a series of frames as a work of art in their own right? These questions, and the ones that emerge from them, are meant to test the limits of animation. They introduce the possibility of looking at animation differently. My research has revisited a historic method of movement analysis and animated films from a pivotal era. I propose that we look past their immediate attractions towards the elements of their construction, to focus on movement and the aesthetics that operate in this space, the imperceptible made perceptible. As Muybridge and Maury revealed in their 19th century audiences, sequences alone can inspire wonder. Cool. Thank you very much. Would people be interested in seeing the film?
I think that would be great, Bronwyn.
Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing because I think I've got to share with sound. Okay, let me just... Okay, just tell me if you can hear sound. You can hear it, okay, cool. Okay, so that is my presentation.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn.
Pleasure.
I forgot to say at the very beginning that that we have the chat function. So, you know, should people have questions that they want to ask Bronwyn, we could happily take them out loud. But if you don't want to speak them out loud, then you could type them into the chat here. I've got questions and thoughts and whatnot, but I'm sure Fasna has got more than me, or at least more informed questions than me. So I'm going to let you go first, Fasna.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. It was really interesting. It just made me to think about expanded animation when I see your exhibition, and I was just imagine if someone ran, you know, and blink, it could see the animation somehow, and it was really interesting for me. How do you did you see it in that way as well?
Yeah,
in your exhibition?
Yeah, and I think it was also had an interesting effect because I had a whole lot of zoetropes and phenakistoscopes at the exhibition that I created from the animation itself. So people were playing with them and trying to understand, things about movements and how animation is created. But then also I had I showed you an image of like one of the sequences of Goofy running that was installed in the gallery because it was a very big space. And a few people reported to me like seeing people in the gallery running around trying to experience that movement through that large installation. So, no, definitely. I mean, it was an aim, it was part of the aim of the research. And I think it was quite successful in that, especially the exhibition ended up being quite interactive and having people really engage and having fun with it. And I think that was the idea from the beginning, was I wanted it to be really fun and, enjoyable. And whilst learning about the process of animation and how it's constructed. So yeah.
Yeah, because it just seemed to me as a very giant zoetrope.
Yeah.
That part of installation, it was really interesting.
So I had two. So one that you had to walk around, and then one that you could stand in the middle and then like sort of spin yourself around to experience the motion. But it was also just about seeing like how those different frames make up a movement. And also just the sheer volumes of, because I had lots of stacks of paper, like like a 2-second shot would amount to like a stack that high, and I would frame them so people could see how much work is involved in just creating a single movement. And then the kind of frames that make up that movement that we don't necessarily see, it's like, why is that frame so out of place? It's because that's the one that we don't see, but it gives like impact to the motion.
Then it is somehow a very physical process of making animation, the real physical frames.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I think it was a very nice way of engaging with it. It takes the process of rendering and it makes it 50 times harder than what it really is when you just do it digitally. But it was a lot of fun to be able to see it coming to life, and then playing with the frames and doing different things with them, placing them differently on the table and seeing what they do to shadows, and that whole process was it added a whole element that I wasn't quite expecting at the time. But it became a very intrinsic part of the process.
Is there an example of that moment that something unexpected happened to you and then you think that this is it?
I don't know. I was so well organized. I really planned this thing for years because I was registered from 2014. So it took me about 3 or 4 years to actually get going on the creative work. So I had all these ideas and I planned it meticulously. I think I spent a year planning every little part of the pipeline because laser cutting is very unforgiving. It's a very systematic process. Everything has to be, in place. So I don't think there were any moments where it was like, something happened that I didn't expect to happen. But I think when I saw it for the first time, those first like 10 frames lined up on like lying on top of each other, I was so pleased that it was actually going to work. I think it was all unknown until that point. And then of course the filming, like there was no way you could test the process using After Effects, but it's so much work to set it up. So I didn't ever get to that point because I was just under the gun and I had to get it finished on time. So I never actually tested to see what the motion was going to look like. I just went with it and I thought, I planned this so well, it's going to work. And then when it came to filming, I don't think I've ever been as scared as I was in that week because I just didn't know how it was going to unfold. But everything worked so perfectly and I was just so happy with the way it came out. So that was maybe one of those aha moments.
Simon, do you want to say something?
I put a hand up very briefly, but it's to do with the exhibition in a way. It's intriguing to hear that you said you planned the exhibition a year in advance. It seems to me the exhibition was key to addressing one of the primary questions in your project about how does one make the production process or the process of animation visible or comprehensible to an audience, and in a way you do that slightly with the epilogue to the film, I noticed, but it must be the exhibition must have been in a way crucial to that aspect of communicating your process to the audience.
Yeah, I think it was, and I was very set on doing it. That's why I booked the exhibition so far ahead of time, because it's not a project it's not a film that's supposed to work on its own. And when a lot of people saw it for the first time, they felt that it looked like it could have been digital, maybe fake to look a little bit handmade. And I think the exhibition confirms that, you know, every single frame was made. I mean, I've still got them lying all around me stacked, you know. So that exhibition, and also just looking at different ways of seeing sequences of images, because, you know, in the thesis I'm talking about the cinematic and the projected image versus the static image, where you've got more time to look at things. So those frames repurposed in different formats was very important, you know, to the thesis and all the theory that I'm talking about. So yeah.
If I could ask another question.
Sure, Simon. It's all yours.
No, it's all yours, really. But one thing about the process that I wanted to ask about a bit more was to do with that digital intermediary step. You know, when you take the frames, as it were, into the digital program, which I don't know what that is, but you seem to isolate the characters in there, and then you showed them in a three-dimensional environment. I wondered what that process was, or what the significance of that process was for you to go from the film sequences to your laser cut frames and that digital intermediary. What were you doing in that process in particular?
Well, I mean, that's the part where I was really analyzing the motion from those episodes that I was interested in. But I mean, I think what I was really thinking about was that, you know, chronophotography and the study of motion is so integral to the process of animation. And I don't think animators maybe realize to what extent that actually happens. And that's why I put a lot of it in there, because it's all about the poses and the timing and how things, you know, work together in a sequential format. And, you know, I've questioned the whole process 100,000 times, saying like, I should be doing this in 2D, because it doesn't make sense to do it in 3D, because you create these rigs and these characters, you know, the meshes, and it's very time consuming. But I'm not a 2D animator, so it was like, this is what I know, this is what I'm going with. And so, but once the characters were made and they were, you know, I just had to render out black and white images, it became very easy. But what I needed was those vector lines for the laser cutter to read, because it only reads vectors. So I needed some kind of information from those renders, and that's really, yeah, it was a lot of work to get to a few lines, but drawing them just wasn't an option for me. It wasn't my process. It wasn't where I was comfortable at all.
Great, thanks. I'm keeping an eye on the chat here, and it looks like Carmen has a. Sorry, Farzan, I'm jumping in. Do you mind?
No. Go on, Simon. Go on.
I've been excited by this talk, but Carmen has a question I noticed in the chat. Carmen, you could speak the question. You could unmute yourself and announce it.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Okay, so just wanted to say thank you to Bronja for the presentation. That was really exciting to see both the preparation and then the process, and yeah, really good. So my question is a little bit, maybe I'm not sure, but maybe in line with what Simon was saying about this whole like your focus on the analysis of movement. I think that's interesting. So I was thinking this division between the analysis of movement and then the production pipeline, and I was wondering if you had any like thoughts or insights into like the idea of motion in animation. Like, did you have an interpretation of what this pipeline process did to how the aesthetic of motion kind of came about into the finished films? So I don't know if it's a clear question, but I'm just trying to figure out this bridge between the analysis of movement and then the insights you got from the production and pipeline of creating this movement, and if that says something special, or it kind of repeats some important points about animation as this, you know, very practical image making process.
Yeah, so I think You know, what I really intended to do, what I wanted to do from the onset, was create a chronophotographic analysis of animation within the animated medium. So there's a couple of ways you could go about doing that, but obviously you're looking at existing animation. I didn't want to necessarily create my own animation because it was more about,
Right.
If you look at how Maury and Muybridge, they had gymnasts and professionals performing actions so that they could study how they move naturally. And my idea was, okay, well, I want to study somebody else's movements, who created animated movements, who knows what they're doing, rather than my idea of how a movement should be constructed, which is why I chose animation from the golden age. But I think through that process, what became quite apparent for me was that, it was always about movement and the frames that made up that movement. And it just emphasized and illuminated the whole process of motion analysis over and over again. And I think because it was so systematic and so repetitive, because, I was working with the 3D characters, then I was rendering them, then I was dealing with the vector images, and then I was laser cutting them. So I was re-looking at these images over and over again. I think I could recreate these scenes sort of like in my dreams. I understand what motion, how it was interpreted, how it was projected in those films. The only unfortunate thing is, like, I was quite, I wanted a piece of music that wasn't integral to the piece of the work too much, but I wanted it to be fun and exciting, but then I wanted the animation to fit the music. So I was a little bit limited in that. Once I found the piece of music that I liked, the animation sort of had to fit. So you'll see there's little accents and parts that hit, like certain parts of the music. And through that process, I lost so many shots that I really wanted to analyze. It's almost like I wanted to make a 10-minute movie because there was so much I wanted to do. I mean, if you just think of the golden age of animation, there's so much rich resource material that I unfortunately missed because of just constraints of the project, like scope. I just couldn't go bigger than this. But yeah, and I don't know if that's answered your question at all, but it was really just, it was all about a focus on movement and analysis of how animated movement was created. And I think that was just emphasized throughout the whole project and the whole process for me. I don't know how it was accepted by the audience. I mean, I know it was very positive and people enjoyed it, but I don't know what people personally got from it. And if it became about movements for them, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's good. That's a very interesting answer. I definitely liked your take on kind of what part of the movement you are actually researching, because I was also going to ask, why didn't you make your own animations? Was what part of that very animator's mindset you were kind of missing out on? But I think you gave a good answer, and maybe kind of pushing the debate more into the production and the pipelines, because I think something happens when you can like completely stop the animation's natural frame by frame display, and then you break that motion out. So it's almost like, these frames that used to come together can like split over time. So it's kind of like it's thought together, but then it's decomposed and then it's composed back again, and it kind of makes the whole idea of time and movement really abstract or really conceptual in some maybe unexpected ways. Yeah. Thank you.
I love that. I mean, I suggest you also just look up strata stencil, because some people have done some very interesting stuff with that technique that's also sort of like expanded, like you're talking about expanding time and bringing it back together. I mean, there's one video called Kitachi. It's like I think it's a Japanese musician who they create the strata stencil but out of perspex, and they end up, they film every frame, they just lay the perspex in front of each other, and then at the end it's this big sculptural form. And it's so weird to see time and animated movements as a single piece of work in the middle of a room. It's really fascinating, and I absolutely love the strata stencil technique. I think it's got so much potential, and people must really take it further. Not many people have tried it, and I've noticed a lot of people have done it digitally, because I think it's just it's so labor intensive that you don't really want to go down that route unless you're serious about it. But yeah, it's a beautiful technique, and I think it's got a lot of potential, especially for analyzing movement and time and all of those kind of things.
On the topic of strata stencils, when I saw them, I couldn't help but think of those wax experiments by Oscar Fischinger. Do you know those, Bron?
Yeah, so that was what David Daniels sort of extended his research on. So Oscar Fischinger used to play with it. I think it was in the 1920s, but he was using wax rather than clay. And then David Daniels started because he explains his process as I think at the in his family at the dinner table, like when he was from 7 years old, he used to play with clay and do things with them. And then he thought, what would happen if I start cutting them up and stuff like that? And that's how he developed that strata cut technique. And, Jovan Ivy, who developed the strata stencil, really was very influenced by that whole process of, cutting away at something to reveal something else, which is how he came up with strata stencil. It's very fascinating.
There is another question I can see. Jonathan.
Hi there. Yeah, can you hear me? Is that clear?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, fantastic. I'll just put my camera on for a moment. First of all, thank you, Bronwyn, for sharing your practice with us. I thought that was brilliant, and a really, truly compelling at the end. I think my jaw dropped when I actually saw the animation playing. And I really love how it was quite a deep dive analysis into what's happening within the animation. Like you said in your talk, much of what happens on the screen isn't really seen. You could say it's felt, isn't it? Particularly with breakdowns. Very strange things happen between key poses, which I think your work started to kind of reveal that. And my question is, have you considered this technique as a kind of tool for onboarding or training new animators? For example, with an educational setting or as part of a pedagogy. Have you thought about that process? Because that's what really caught my eye. I thought, wow, for a new animator to actually physically see everything that's happening, it's like switching a light on, quite literally.
Yeah, no, it is. And
I'll be quiet, let you respond.
It is something that I didn't really initially think of. I mean, I wanted an educational aspect to the exhibition, but more from like how is animation created, using like little devices like the phenakistoscope and the zoetrope. But one of my colleagues went to go see the exhibition, and when he came back, he was blown away, and he was like, everybody in animation who is marginally interested has to go see that exhibition. So I think for him, he had that sort of like experience of like, this is what it's all about. This is what people need to understand in order to, embark on the medium. And I didn't really think of that from the beginning. I think it was something that was sort of like a happy accident that kind of worked that way. But yeah, no, it definitely does. It's a huge educational aspect. And I think, there are animations that try allude to that process of revealing their modes of construction for the viewer, to learn a little bit more about how animation's made. But some of them do it a little bit too conceptually, and I don't think people really get that. I think animators tend to like, I see what they're getting at there. But yeah, this makes it a little bit more practical and a little bit more, easier to engage with. Definitely.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's been fantastic to have questions from the wider audience. If anyone else out there has a question and would like to introduce them, that would be wonderful. Another reference point that I couldn't help thinking about when you showed your film as a series of stills in a grid, is that the Peter Kubelka film Arnold Reiner. I don't know if you know that. It's an animation, more or less, of just black and white frames, avant-garde classic from 1957, in which he at some point printed it out as the complete series of frames. Also, another avant-garde filmmaker called Paul Scharatz, who did the same for his film, so that, as a kind of to illuminate the process again, I suppose, which, as you suggest, lots of animators have tried to do in one way or another, reveal their process of production. But
yeah, that one was quite a happy accident, and it really just came about because of the sheer size of the exhibition space. It was really big, and I was worried about filling the space. I mean, I had lots of frames, but I didn't have, you know, like a ton of money to reappropriate them in different ways. I mean, I was cutting perspex, you know, trying to get those expanded frames, and it was getting very expensive. And then we just thought of this idea of like, why not print the whole film on this giant piece of canvas and stick it on the wall? And it ended up looking so amazing. And it felt to me very much, it was very reminiscent of a Muybridge print, you know, of where he would, you know, separate those discrete images of a movement. Yeah, so when in my thesis I speak about format and influences and methods of reading work, I think that really comes across, which, you know, had the space not been as big, I might not have gone down that road. It was really just about how do I fill space really quickly, because I finished the film in January and the exhibition was in February, so I literally had a month to put everything together in order to exhibit it. It was quite tight.
I suppose there's the depth you have in the picture plane as well, which I only just thinking about now. But in, you know, chronophotography is obviously has always been a two-dimensional medium, and you see the sequence of events over a movement depicted over a sequence of still images, or indeed in one image. But in your film, you have that kind of depth as well, which, you know, the depth allows you to show the sequence of images, but you do so through the illusion of three dimensions.
Yeah.
Does that bring something additional or new to it?
Yeah, possibly. I think what I was really trying to get at, I wanted the aesthetic of a Mari image, so those superimposed images of movement. And I didn't want to do it digitally. I wanted the material aspect to it. I wanted, you know, to have something that was tangible. And so I think I guess, you know, if you look at Norman McLaren's film, Net Pas de Dieu, where he sort of did it in the filmic medium. You know, I think that's possible in animation, but that's not really what I was going for. And you know, when I saw the Strata stencil, for me, it provided all the tools I needed to be able to recreate that aesthetic in a moving medium. And you know, the depth was tricky, getting the idea of like how many frames to keep visible, and getting, because the parallax effect, so you couldn't have them too far apart from each other. It got very difficult. And then also the lighting, because too much lighting and direct lighting just caused shadows all over the place, and then you couldn't see what was going on. So that's why I kept it very monochromatic, you know, to keep it very simple and a focus on movement, and to try to get that lighting working with that three-dimensional space so that you can get that feeling. And I think, yeah, I mean, it ended up working after a lot of experimentation and moving things backwards and forwards and trying different things, and it ended up working quite well.
The superimpositions also seem to me as some kind of motion blur. Did you think about it as well?
Not from the superimposition perspective. I think that happened naturally with the focus on the front frame. They did get a little bit blurrier as they went back, so it happened naturally, but it wasn't really an intention.
Because I can imagine if there isn't any superimposition, maybe it would be a kind of jump from one frame into another.
Yeah.
Like when you flip, you know, some images.
Yeah, like a flip book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but also what that technique does by keeping all of those frames is it slows the animation down, and it was a little bit frustrating, but it was kind of doing what I wanted it to do, you know, because it allowed you more time to experience what a movement was doing, like how a hand went up, how a run cycle worked. But it made it feel a lot slower, which I struggled to then time back with the music, because, you know, I timed everything to the music with just a single frame with the original footage, and it worked so well. And then when I did this technique, it's like, oh, no, it doesn't seem like it works anymore. But I think, you know, the visual aim that I had for that was to be able to analyze the movement. So it did work from that sense.
Fazna, I can see that Carmen has another question, which is wonderful. I'm just wondering about, you know, time-wise, perhaps we should have Carmen's question, and then we will come to the end of our time. So Carmen, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's very nice to hear all this discussion. I really like it, all these thoughts and all the details that goes into figuring out the interesting bits. But yeah, I was just contemplating like your selection of animations, and I know you are interested in character animation, so it makes perfect sense that you chose some figurative animations. Maybe also partially because Muybridge used people, like he started with something we could recognize. So I was kind of thinking, maybe not in your final thesis, but were there any stage in your own research where you thought, what if this, like, what if you're not thinking in units, like, there's point A to B, and then that's the unit of movement I'm going to analyze. But let's imagine like Stan Brakhage treat it with your pipeline. I think what could that say something interesting? So how was your thought about the selection of films you choose? Like, was there did you have some ideas about other types of categories you could use? So I'm just curious to kind of figure out how you defined your scope, or what that process was for you.
No, I think definitely. I think it was a lot bigger when I started, because I imagined there being a lot more abstract images, because I was thinking of the frame by frame approach when I started this project, and I thought that I would need like transitions between the actions, because obviously coming from a narrative background of how to tell a story, and now I had to like I'm just working with montage shots of action sequences, how to make them work and flow between each other. So I started looking at different abstractions and like morphing and transforming from one image to the other. But it was interesting that the more I studied the technique, that those morphs and ways of montaging wasn't necessary, because the movement almost does it itself, the technique. So you cut off a frame, that one moves back and the new one comes in, and it happens automatically. So I was thinking a lot about abstract designs, which never ended up going into it. I wanted a lot more extreme stuff like smears and stretches but it was hard to interpret into laser cutting. So laser cutting was very limiting in that everything had to be connected to a frame or else it would fall apart. So there always had to be something touching the side of the frame. A lot of the things just wouldn't work, because if you use, like, say, for the Dover Boys of Pimento University, where he's got that character Chuck Jones, where he has these very rapid movements and he has these massive smears. And unfortunately, if you have something that big on a strata stencil frame, it's just going to block everything. So you'll see there's a few times where I have these explosions to just try and get rid of a frame to bring on a new one. And that's the kind of effect it would have had, and you would have lost the whole feeling of the movement. So, I mean, I tried various things and I had different ideas, but they didn't all amalgamate. And I realized that I even had backgrounds in the beginning, but the backgrounds were so distracting. You couldn't see the motion at all. It didn't work. So, yeah, it was just about a process of simplification for me. So the more simple you made the figures, the better it worked. So I just tried to, in the end, you'll see there's some environments in some of the shots. Those were ones that were done earlier and weren't as successful, but I ran out of time and I couldn't replace them. But yeah, for me, the more successful ones is where it's just focused on character. Obviously, there's lots of ways this could go. I see someone was asking about using it for fluid or smoke. There were a few scenes where I used smoke and it ended up looking beautiful. I didn't expect it to. I think that the thing you've got to be careful with is to keep that negative space. Because the second you lose that negative space, you lose that whole depth and that flow of movement. So it's just about designing and thinking a bit around about, what exactly you want to test in this and see if it works.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen, for your question. And well done, Bronwyn, for picking up that one from David, which I think it was kind of related there. Yeah, very much.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, thanks.
Fasna, I think time-wise, we should wrap it up now.
Yeah.
There's a question here from a guest saying, they miscalculated the time zone. It's wonderful to think that people are beaming in from different time zones. And this seminar series has only been going, this is the third session, but it does seem to be an international affair, which is wonderful. It is being recorded and it will be available, and Farzaneh will be able to tell you where.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to put the link here. That's our YouTube channel, and you can find all the recordings in here.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you again for organizing these presentations. You know, I do belong to a writing group, an animation writing group. I don't know if any of them are here tonight, but it's a very lonely process doing a PhD, and especially in a country where it's only me and another person in our institution who are focusing on animation. And I think, you know, these kind of forums really just bring us all together, thinking about a similar subject at least. So thank you so much for organizing that. They're fantastic.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn, for being here today. And Simon, please, can you wrap the session up for us?
Yeah, Bronwyn, thanks. That was a wonderful presentation. Ordinarily, when the previous sessions we've had at least we've had 3 speakers. We had 2 lined up for today, but you've more than covered, more than captivated our attention for this slot. So thank you very much. It was very interesting, and thanks very much for the questions from people. I'm sure Farzaneh will be putting out a subsequent call for presentations from more PhD animation researchers. So watch the spaces where she publishes her requests for expressions of interest. We try and think about putting people together whose work kind of whose projects speak to each other. That's been the rationale so far, hasn't it? Yes, undoubtedly there'll be another one of these in due course. And yes, thanks all. The recording will, I don't know where I download it. I'll find it somewhere. I'll send it to Farzaneh, and then it comes online. But anyway, that's it for this one. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.